You've stepped off the lighted road and onto a path that few return from. Welcome to the hunting path 1408. Tonight's story is one that should have never been told. They Rot. Chapter 1. The rain tapped a slow, steady rhythm against the window pane of their small living room in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Outside, the early spring air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth, a familiar, comforting smell that now felt tinged with something unsettling. Inside, the air was thick with a different kind of tension, a palpable unease that settled over the cozy space like a shroud. The room, usually filled with the cheerful clutter of Lily's toys and the comforting aroma of coffee, felt strangely still. The only sounds, the persistent drumming of the rain and the low murmur of the television. 10-year-old Lily sat cross-legged on the worn rug, its faded floral pattern a stark contrast to the grim images on the screen. Her eyes, wide and a little fearful, were glued to the flickering news report. Her father, David, sat on the couch behind her, the springs groaning softly as he shifted, his arm resting protectively on her shoulder. The anchors on the national news were trying to maintain composure, their practiced professionalism cracking under the strain. Their voices were tight, their smiles gone, replaced by expressions of thinly veiled alarm.
Reports of widespread civil unrest continue across several major cities,
the female anchor said, her brow furrowed with worry lines that seemed deeper than usual.
Authorities are urging citizens to remain calm and shelter in place. We're receiving unconfirmed reports of unusual behavior among some individuals involved in these incidents.
Unusual behavior?
Lily echoed, looking up at her dad, her voice small.
What does that mean?
David squeezed her shoulder, the rough fabric of his flannel shirt a familiar comfort against her cheek.
I don't know, sweetie. Probably just people being scared and acting crazy.
He tried to sound reassuring, his voice a little too loud in the quiet room, but his eyes were fixed on the screen, a knot tightening in his stomach. The national broadcast cut abruptly to local news, showing grainy, shaky footage from Nashville. Chaos on the streets, shouting and figures moving with disturbing jerky motions that sent a shiver down David's spine. The video was poor quality, but the unnatural angles of limbs, the stumbling gait, were unmistakable.
Dad, that looks scared,
Lily whispered, clutching his arm, her small fingers digging into his bicep.
It's okay, Lil,
he said, though his heart was starting to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He'd seen enough movies, read enough books, to feel a cold dread creeping into his gut, a primal fear that whispered of things that shouldn't be possible.
We need to think. We need supplies.
He stood up, the worn floorboards creaking under his weight, pacing towards the kitchen window. The street outside looked deceptively normal, quiet, wet, a few cars passing through the misty rain. The houses across the street, nestled amongst the trees, seemed peaceful, unaware of the growing terror that was spreading. But the news was screaming something wasn't normal at all. The world outside their small, quiet town felt like it was unraveling at a terrifying speed.
Okay, Lilybug,
he said, turning back to her, his voice firm, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel.
We're going to the grocery store, right now. We need food, water, batteries, everything we can get, before everyone else does.
Lily's eyes widened, reflecting the flickering light of the television.
Now? In the rain?
Yes, now, before things get worse. Much worse.
He grabbed his keys from the small wooden bowl by the door and slung a worn backpack over his shoulder.
Get your jacket and stay right by me, okay? No running off, not for a second.
The drive to the local food city was short but tense. The familiar route, usually a pleasant drive through the scenic foothills, felt charged with an unseen energy. Every car they passed seemed to be driving too fast, their drivers' faces set and anxious. Every pedestrian on the sidewalk looked wary, their eyes scanning their surroundings as if expecting trouble. As they pulled into the parking lot, David's stomach dropped. It was packed, cars overflowing the designated spaces, spilling onto the access road. People were running towards the entrance, a frantic, desperate energy in their movements.
Oh no.
Lily breathed from the back seat, her voice filled with awe and apprehension.
Yeah. Stay close,
David repeated, parking quickly in a spot far from the entrance, the rain slicking the asphalt. Stepping out of the car felt like entering a different world entirely. The air, already cool and damp, now buzzed with a chaotic, panicked energy. The cheerful facade of the grocery store was gone, replaced by a scene of pure pandemonium. People were shoving past each other, their faces grim and determined. Carts rattled and clattered, some overturned, spilling their contents onto the wet ground. Voices were raised in fear and anger, a cacophony of anxiety. Inside the store, it was even worse. Aisles were already half empty, shelves stripped bare of essentials like bottled water, canned goods, and toilet paper. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unflattering glow on the scene of desperation.
They right behind Mate Lil,
David said, his voice low and urgent, pushing a cart through the throng. He grabbed the first things he could reach, his hands shaking slightly. A bag of rice, a few cans of beans, some granola bars, anything that looked like it would last. Lily clung to the back of the cart, her small hands gripping the metal bar, her face pale and wide-eyed as she took in the chaotic scene.
Dad, look.
She pointed towards the back of the store, near the pharmacy counter. A group of people were arguing, their voices escalating into shouts, their gestures wild and angry.
Don't look, Lil,
David said, trying to shield her view with his body as he reached for a jug of water, his mind racing. He needed to get what they needed and get out of here, fast. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the store, sharp and deafening above the din of the crowd. Then another, closer this time. Screams erupted, sharper, more terrified than before, cutting through the general panic. People scattered, abandoning their carts, ducking behind aisles, their faces contorted in fear. David instinctively pulled Lily into the narrow space between two shelves, crouching down, covering her small body with his own, the scent of cheap detergent and dust filling his nostrils.
Stay down,
He murmured into her hair, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The rough texture of her jacket felt strangely comforting against his cheek. The shouting continued, a mix of fear and confusion, followed by the sound of running feet, a stampede of panic. Peeking cautiously over the edge of the shelf, David saw a man lying on the floor near the checkout lanes, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. A small crowd had gathered around him, some screaming hysterically, others just staring in stunned horror, their faces blank with disbelief.
He's not moving.
Lily whispered, her voice muffled against his jacket, peeking out from under his arm. David pulled her back down, pressing her closer.
Don't look, Lily. Just stay with me.
He tried to shield her from the sight, from the growing dread that was consuming him. But then something impossible happened. The man on the floor, the one who wasn't moving, began to stir. His limbs twitched erratically, like a marionette with tangled strings. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound that was utterly wrong, utterly inhuman. A guttural noise that scraped against David's nerves. His head lifted slowly, his neck bending at an unnatural angle, his eyes vacant and milky, fixed on nothing, yet somehow terrifyingly focused. The small crowd around him recoiled as if struck, their screams turning into shrieks of pure terror, a sound that would forever be etched in David's memory. One woman stumbled backward, tripping over a discarded cart, falling with a cry. The man on the floor, the dead man, pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, his movements jerky and unnatural, his body seemingly disconnected from his will. Lily gasped, a small, choked sound against David's chest. He didn't need to look at her face to know she had seen it too. seeing the impossible, the horrifying truth unfolding before them. His blood ran cold, turning to ice in his veins. This wasn't civil unrest. This wasn't just people acting crazy. This was something else, something monstrous. The man on the floor, slowly, deliberately, began to rise to his feet, a chilling, undeniable harbinger of the nightmare that had just begun. The mundane setting of the grocery store, with its bright lights and cheerful displays, had become the stage for the end of the world as they knew it. You've reached the end of this story, but the path doesn't stop here. Shadows still stir, the walls still whisper. So if you're still listening, you've taken another step down the haunting path 1408. Subscribe if you dare to walk it again.